Hi there, I'm Lindsay Bugbee, and today we're going to talk about how to use Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed-proof white ink to make beautiful white calligraphy. This is my very favorite white calligraphy ink because it's so dependable and opaque. I've tried a lot of other white inks, and granted, with any white ink, you're going to have some compromises. So white ink, if it's going to be opaque, it just has to be paint-like. So already you're working there with a thicker viscosity than you would if you were using, say, iron gall or walnut ink. And that brings its own set of problems with it, like a nib that gunks up quickly, or, when you have water evaporating out of the ink, it gets very thick and unusable. At a pace that another ink probably wouldn't encounter, right? So we'll talk about that, especially in regards to this ink today. And I'll give you some tips for being able to use this ink, how to really harness its power. Bleed-proof white ink has stymied many a pointed pen calligraphy beginner because you hear all these great things about it, and then you open it, and it is a white mass. And a lot of times it will look a whole lot worse than this. I've used this ink before, so it already has water incorporated into it, but often you will receive this ink and it will just be this white gunky mess that might even be favoring one side of the bottle, like it's all sort of stuck to the side there. If you get your ink like that, don't freak out. That's how it's supposed to look. What you need to do is always make sure you have some clean water at hand. And then if you have a blunt art syringe, that's always super useful for this ink. Otherwise, you can just use a teaspoon, but put in a fair amount of water. So I am using about 0.5 milliliters. Put that into the ink. And then I keep a chopstick on hand to mix this up. And notice I'm just going to go about an inch in and incorporate that water into the ink with that inch. So why am I not going all the way down to the bottom of the bottle? Because I don't want to pull in all of the thick ink. I just want to work with that top third of the bottle, because if I need to pull in more ink, more of that thick stuff, then I have the option to do that. You don't want to treat the entire bottle with water, just the top part. And then you can wipe that off. And at this point, it's a good idea to talk about the tools that will set you up for success with white ink. So if you're working with white ink, a white mechanical pencil is going to be your best friend. So you can use it in order to create white guidelines on dark papers. So we're talking black paper, obviously, also deep red, deep blue, anything that you're going to have trouble seeing a regular graphite pencil on. Also helpful to have around, black eraser. I use this because sometimes when you use white erasers on dark papers, it leaves a bit of a sheen. The black eraser does not leave any sheen. So it's not a must-have, but it's certainly nice to have around. Okay, so moment of truth with our white ink. You dip in a fairly flexible nib. I find that white ink works best with a nib like the Browse Rose or the Browse Extra Fine 66, which I'm using today. And then you just test it out. Okay, that is writing beautifully. So you're getting nice thick downstrokes. And more importantly, the upstrokes are not skipping. But let's talk about troubleshooting. So what happens when you're not having this great experience? What happens when you go to make an upstroke and the ink is skipping? And hold on, I think I've got a bottle of ink that doesn't have water incorporated into it. So let's use that to demo. This ink that I've incorporated water into is writing really well, but I want to demo what happens when you don't have enough water in your ink. This bleed-proof white ink doesn't have a lot of water in it, and let's see what happens when we try to write with it. It's very, very thick. And when we try to make an upstroke, it's just not reliable. That ink really wants to stay on the nib. And typically, when you're using white ink that's too thick, it's okay on the downstrokes, and it will flow on those downstrokes, and you might even be able to make it through a couple of upstrokes. But invariably, you get to an upstroke and it will just taper off, or it's not very consistent. It has a real chalky look. It's not flowing on the upstrokes. So that is a surefire signal that you need to add more water to your ink. So your next question might be, well, okay, I add water to the ink. What if I add too much water to the ink? So that is where it's really important to really focus on that top third of the bottle when you're mixing in the water, because if you have too much water in your ink, and you'll know you have too much water because the white ink will look a bit translucent when you're putting it on the page. I want to emphasize it is difficult to get too much water in there. So it's easy to not have enough water, but typically people don't add too much. If you do, then what you need to do is dip your chopstick further down in there. Incorporate more of that viscous, untouched ink into the water at the top. So that's why we always focus on that first third, because the bottom 2/3 of this ink are insurance. It helps to make sure that we're always going to have an opaque ink, because there's always a reserve of really concentrated ink for us to incorporate more water into, if that makes sense. So you'll know that you've got the right viscosity, because when you go to write, you shouldn't encounter any difficulties with the upstrokes. Like I said, downstrokes are kind of a gimme no matter what viscosity you have, but your upstrokes should be nice and smooth and shouldn't give you any chalky resistance. Let's talk about the bleed proof in the title of Bleed Proof White Ink. When I first heard bleed proof, I guess you kind of associate that with bulletproof, like, oh yeah, this ink is really going to stay on. No, what bleed proof means is that the pigments are large enough in this ink that they are not going to bleed into the paper. You're not going to get any sort of feathering. So that's what it refers to. Now, as far as waterproof properties for this ink, bleed proof white ink is actually referred to as a watercolor. I would have called it an acrylic because it's so opaque, but no, it's more like a gouache or a watercolor. So let me just get my finger wet here and show you. You see, it smudges like crazy. So what you'll want to do is make sure that if you use this on an envelope or something that is going to potentially be exposed to fingers or the elements, you'll want to treat it with microglaze. And I have a separate tutorial showing you how to use microglaze. It's just a protectant that makes sure that whatever this ink comes in contact with is not going to hurt it. Another important aspect of bleed proof white ink to consider is drying time. I often liken this ink to nail polish because, you know, you'll paint your nails, they look great, they feel like they're dry, but then as soon as you put them to the test, they're gonna smudge. And it's the same thing with this ink. You can touch it and it feels like it's dry, but then as soon as you go over it with an eraser, it smudges. So you need to give this ink as much time to dry as you possibly can. I'm lucky in some senses because I live here in Colorado where it is really dry. So I can get away with waiting like an hour or two, and then I can erase my guidelines with a fair amount of confidence. But I've heard from TPK readers in humid areas like Hawaii that even after 3 days, this ink has not dried. So if you live in a super humid area, it might not be a bad idea to pop your work into a dehydrator or maybe use a hair dryer to evaporate some of that moisture out of the ink. Or if it's an emergency, you really need to erase your guidelines, try to erase around the calligraphy. So don't go over any of the downstrokes, because that's where you're going to get that unpleasant surprise that this has not quite dried yet, is in the downstrokes. No matter how careful you are with erasing your pencil guidelines, eventually on some project you're doing, you're going to get a smudge. How do you deal with that? I always just use an X-Acto knife and try to chip at that bleed-proof white ink. If that doesn't quite do the trick, sometimes it can work to use another ink color that matches the page that you're working on. So for example, I could use Sumi ink to potentially blot over some of this white here. If you're working on a paper like a red colored paper, that might be a little more difficult, but that's certainly something to try. But yeah, your best friend is just going to be prevention. So give the piece at least overnight to dry the first few times you use bleed-proof white ink. See if that works for you. If you have the time to make some tester pages, that would be a really good idea. So, make maybe 3 or 4 pages of just one word or a couple of letters of calligraphy written in bleed-proof white ink. Try erasing guidelines on one of them after 2 hours. Try erasing guidelines on the other one after 4 hours, just to see how your climate affects the drying time of the ink, because your drying time is going to be different from my drying time unless you live in the Denver, Boulder area. All right, let's talk about the takeaways from this lesson while I work a little bit with this ink. So first of all, you are always going to need to dilute your white ink with water. And that's probably going to happen every single session that you're going to need to incorporate some water in. If you're having trouble on upstrokes, that means that you need to incorporate more water into your bleed-proof white ink. If the ink is too translucent, that means that you need to incorporate more of the viscous ink at the bottom of the bottle into your water/ink mixture. One thing I didn't mention is that since this ink has such thick particles in it, that it's so viscous, you are going to need to wipe off your nib fairly often so it doesn't gunk up. So be sure and do that as you're writing. Otherwise, you'll get an unpleasantly thick surprise on your upstrokes. And then wait a long time before erasing your pencil guidelines. If you need to draw pencil guidelines, use a white mechanical pencil. Once you're certain that ink has dried, you've given it until at least overnight, use a black eraser to erase your pencil guidelines if possible. If you encounter smudging, you can use an X-Acto knife to scrape that smudging off. And yeah, that is bleed-proof white ink in a nutshell. If you have any other questions about it, just ask me in the comments. I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.